I'm Walter Bodmer, and I've been chairman of the Fisher Memorial Trust. I looked it up the other day for 42 years, I remember that. Anyway, quite a long time, but I thought I'd better tell you a little bit about the trust. It was founded shortly after Fisher died. He died in 1962, and it was founded in order to promote interest in the life and work of the great statistician, evolutionary biologist, and geneticist Sir Ronald Fisher, and to maintain his scientific legacy by encouraging discussion of the scientific fields in which he was active. It's sponsored in a way through its membership by the Genetical Society, by the Biometric Society, the Royal Society, and the Royal Statistical Society, and they have representatives on the committee with fairly modest but good enough meaning. We organise mainly a lecture every year or every other year to commemorate either the statistical side or the genetical side of Fisher's work. And we try and build this together with meetings, and that's why we've incorporated the current lecture to be given by Joe Felsenstein into this meeting. Joe, unfortunately, said he couldn't be here in person, but he should be appearing on the screen any minute now. Are you there, Joe? Joe, there you are.
Am I there? Yes.
Welcome, welcome.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and it's my job to introduce you. Now, I was going to say that Joe is the closest thing I've had to nearly having a student whom I've actually had the pleasure of inviting to give a Fisher Memorial lecture. Right? And I forget the exact year you came with Jim Kerr to Stanford to work with me. Must have been about 64, I guess.
Yes.
I think it was 64, just as you were finishing as an undergraduate. And Joe has had, since that time, a stellar career in population genetics, notably, of course, in developing the ideas of how to make phylogenetic trees, both from frequency data and from DNA sequence data. His phylet, which is the main bit, it's got 34,000 plus. That's one of the main papers. I looked it up. Quotes. It's one of the most quoted papers of all time, the one that introduced that. But he's also done a number of other things in population genetics, questions of the advantage of sex, what things can be explained by that, interaction, selection, linkage, and a variety of other areas. And he's been a major contributor to the field of population and produced a very interesting, I would say, bibliography of all papers on theoretical population genetics up to 1981. So he's a most appropriate person to give a Fisher Memorial Lecture. And Joe, we welcome you very much. And now it's over to you to give your lecture.
I'm assuming that you... Thank you. Can you... thank you. I'm assuming that you can hear me. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Thank you, Walter. It's a pleasure to give the Fisher Lecture. I'm sorry, but that coming for a week, 6,000 miles and being jet lagged was a bit too much for me. And I'm particularly pleased to see Walter. Let me advance my screen here. And so I wanted to say hello to Walter. Here's a photograph of Walter. By the way, does my cursor show on the screen? Could somebody? It does. Okay, so there's Walter in 1973. I used to take photographs of population geneticists, and I posted on a web page in Flickr. If you search under the phrase population geneticists and other evolutionary biologists, you'll see 147 photos of what population geneticists looked like mostly in the 1970s. And here's a photo of Walter at a meeting at Stanford in 1973. And as he indicated, we met each other in 1964. So it's been now 53 years And a few years later, I was in Britain doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Edinburgh in the Institute of Animal Genetics. And there was a new meeting starting, the Population Genetics Group, which is now called the POP Group. So I went down to Birmingham in about the 10th of January of 1968 and attended the first PGG, or the first POP Group. And here's a photo I took at the time of everyone in that meeting. So that would be 6 days from now, that will be 50 years ago. So this photo is 50 years old, and here is a photo of people walking down the stairs in the snow, going to lunch at the first POP Group meeting. I can identify a few people here. This one here is Bill Hill. So that's probably the one that people here will know. But I see some things that are different from the current POP Group. I can see your auditorium, and I can see that very few of you, we have both men and women present in the current auditorium, but if you look in this group, there's exactly one woman here. Everyone else is male. The other thing is everyone seems to be wearing tweed jackets. And I look here and I don't see any. So maybe things have changed in the POP Group. All right. I also should talk about my, excuse me, talk about my own connection to R.A. Fisher, which unfortunately was more or less non-existent. As a student at the University of Wisconsin, I got to see J.B.S. Haldane when he came through in 1963 and gave a talk, and I got to see him interact with people. Sewall Wright was around all the time, and that was where he lived and worked in those years, and so I got quite a good sample of Sewall Wright. But I also used to go to Jim Crow's lab. He let me come by and hang out at his lab. Moto Kimura was then visiting. And one day I didn't go into the lab. I had other things to do. The next day I came in and everybody said Fisher was here. Because R.A. Fisher's daughter, Joan Fisher Box, lived in Madison, and he came through to see her. And a few days later, everyone had photographs of themselves posing with R.A. Fisher. So this is a photograph from the day that I wasn't in the lab. There's, of course, Jim Crow, R.A. Fisher, and Moto Kimura. So that's my only connection with R.A. Fisher. I've experienced him mostly through his students, notably Walter and other people like Anthony Edwards, who had a lot of contact with Fisher, and I hear things about him. And probably, let me see, yes. From what I hear of R.A. Fisher, I really cannot particularly relate to his politics. I cannot particularly relate to his views on religion. And I'm pretty sure that if I got to know him, that I would fall out with him at one point or another, and that might be unpleasant. So perhaps it's just as well. But one thing that I can relate to is his taste for formulating large-scale grand theory, of which the most famous is his fundamental theorem. And I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about the fundamental theorem. There has been a lot of re-examination by people like Anthony Edwards, Warren Ewens, and others of the status of the fundamental theorem, the extent to which one can prove it, what its terms mean. And I think I can fairly summarize by saying that versions of it can be proven. They, however, are phrased in terms of rather obscure quantities. So there is the change in fitness, but it's not the overall change in fitness, it's the change in fitness due to additive effects only, I think, something like that. And the result has been that, yes, as far as I can see, that yes, you can prove some version of the fundamental theorem, but the quantities are a little bit obscure. And I think there's another major issue in considering it to be very fundamental, and that is that the additive genetic variance plays a very important role. The additive genetic variance of fitness plays an important role in the fundamental theorem of natural selection. And of course, we can't really predict what additive genetic variance will be in the future. We know we perhaps can assess it now, but if, for example, the genetic variation that feeds in, that is the additive genetic variance, if that were caused mostly by rare genes and fitnesses being whose gene frequency was low, the gene frequency of the alleles for positive fitness, then our prediction would be in the future that the additive genetic variance would go up as time went on, as those alleles rose in frequency. On the other hand, if the alleles are at high frequency, our prediction would be that in the future the additive genetic variance would go down. And of course, in practical cases, we don't know what those alleles are. We don't know what frequencies they're in. And the result is that the additive genetic variance is somewhat unpredictable in the future. So for both of those reasons, both the obscurity of the meaning of some of its terms and the lack of predictability of the additive genetic variance, I have to regretfully come to the conclusion that the fundamental theorem is not so fundamental, and that although it's fun to work out what Fisher meant by it, I don't think it plays a critical role in modern theoretical population genetics. So I'm going to then pass on to the issue of some other large-scale theories, and particularly I want to talk about, let's see if attempts that have been made to formulate a definition of information, of biological information that is meaningful. Now we can look at the genome and it's very large. We can say, well, if we were to consider all those bases to be meaningful biologically, how much information could there be in the genome? And it's a very large amount. But we know, of course, that large portions of the genome are junk DNA, and we don't. So that calculation is somewhat irrelevant. It's fun, but it's not. It doesn't tell us really how much information. Sorry. How much information has been built into life by evolution that is adaptive information, that's information that leads to the current high functioning of biological systems. Now, there is a, there is an entity called, a definition called specified information that was first put forward by Leslie Orgel, who is shown here, and further developed by Jack Szostak and Robert Hazen. And it, I think, is more relevant, a more relevant version of information. It asks the question, if we look at function, and in my case I'm going to be thinking of function in terms of fitness, it's information which increases the fitness, basically. I could go on for a while on how exactly you define it. Szostak and Hazen, in papers in 2003 and 2007, define something called functional information, which is basically the same thing, but it's better defined. And basically what it is the you take an individual who has a genome and you measure its function. In this case, I'll measure its fitness. And then you ask what fraction of all possible sequences are more fit than that, are as fit or more fit than that. And then you take minus the log to the base 2 of that fraction. For life that we see around us, that's a very it's a very large number. The p, the fraction of individuals of all possible sequences that will be as functional or more functional than some existing life form that we're evaluating is tiny. And thus you get a fairly large amount of information. It's an interesting concept. What I'm going to do is go on and try to connect that to some issues of flow of energy and entropy. So this is going to be very grand theory. In 1978, I published a paper on this. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is really from that paper and some more recent further developments of it. I'm getting back to the subject. The concept of specified information has also been used by creationists and advocates of intelligent design. And let me show you this guy, William Dembski, excuse me, who in the year 2002 wrote a book, No Free Lunch, which argues that he had a law of conservation of complex specified information. So in effect, what Dembski did has had the effect of publicizing specified information. Some people are under the impression that he defined it, but no, he cites it to Orgel. And people are sufficiently unhappy about the arguments that Dembski made that they often dismiss the notion of specified information completely. What Dembski did was to define something called complex specified information, which is simply a certain amount of specified information. It's about 500 bits of specified information. And then he thought he had a law of conservation of complex specified information, which he felt proved that if you started with that level of specified information, that that if you didn't start with that level of specified information, you could never achieve that specified information. Now, for all of us who work on evolutionary genetics, that's a mystifying assertion, because we know that alleles can be selected that will increase fitness, that if you do enough of that, surely you can get up to 500 bits worth of specified information. If you look closely at Dembski's law of conservation of complex specified information in his book, you in fact find that it's invalid. You find fatal flaws, which involve violating the assumption. He has some steps in which he violates his own assumptions. And he also changes the specification in midstream. Instead of saying we have one specification, fitness, and then we argue about whether or not, after evolutionary forces act, you can get that high a level of fitness. To do that, you have to have the same definition, fitness, before and after. What Dembski did was be able to prove his theorem, except only be able to prove it by changing the specification before and after in a way that isn't plausible. So more recently, I wrote an article pointing this out, but even before I wrote that, Dembski had redefined specified information. So if you go and look at his more recent his more recent arguments using complex specified information, you'll find that what he did was to take complex specified information and redefine it. Instead of defining it as a certain level of specified information, he adds a condition. And the condition he adds is that it not be able to be put into the genome by evolutionary forces. Well, the problem with adding that to the condition, to the existence of complex specified information, and saying we only have complex specified information if that level of it cannot be put into the genome by evolutionary forces. That then removes its ability to do the job of detecting when evolutionary forces could put it into the genome. He no longer talks about his conservation law. I think that's a wise move on his part because it was wrong. But now he says complex specified information, and he defines it in such a way that it can't be put in the genome. Otherwise, you don't call it complex specified information. What that does is leave the user to do all the work. You have to first figure out whether evolutionary forces can explain this adaptation before you're allowed to say that it's complex specified information. So the definition has now become useless. But nevertheless, the use of specified information has been something that's been publicized a great deal by this creationist and advocates of intelligent design, this literature, which attempts to use it to show that evolution basically can't happen. Well, what I want to do is move from there to considering more broadly the connection that might exist between entropy, notions of entropy, and these definitions of biological information. And the pioneer, really, the first person, I think, to think about entropy and evolution was Ludwig Boltzmann himself, who is, of course, the great founder of statistical mechanics. And here he is in the middle of his career. And he was, in fact, a great admirer of Charles Darwin. And here are a couple of quotes. First of all, he talks in the first quote about life having a struggle for negative entropy, and which becomes available through the transition of energy from the hot sun to the cold earth. So he had a very modern view of how thermodynamics related to evolution. And he really admired Darwin. Here's a quote showing that, in which he says that the 19th century will not be the century of iron or steam or electricity. It will be called the century of the mechanical view of nature, the century of Darwin. These are from a book chapter by Peter Schuster, which you can find online at his website, where he gives these quotes in the original German and translates them. So there was thinking about how you could relate evolution to entropy, which involves flows of energy, as early as the period right after Darwin, in the form of the thinking of Ludwig Boltzmann. Okay, and since then, particularly since the 1950s, when information theory became popular, there was a big wave of interest in information theory, and a lot of people saw that there ought to be some sort of connection between information theory, thermodynamics, and biological evolution. That maybe there is some law out there that we can find. So it became a kind of a holy grail. Lots of people started writing papers about it, but unfortunately, if you look at those papers, a good place to look is in Journal of Theoretical Biology. It was founded, the first volume of Journal of Theoretical Biology was in 1961. And soon after that, there started to appear papers in it saying, let me tell you about thermodynamics, information theory, and evolution. And there are numbers of these papers, many of them in JTB. And if you look at them, unfortunately, you don't find very much theory. You find a lot of hand-wavy discussion. You find a lot of correct statements about how biological evolution does not contradict the second law of thermodynamics. But when it comes down to producing any kind of quantitative account, the most you get there are equations that are of the form A equals B plus C, which are sort of like this. A is all automobiles, B is blue automobiles, and C is non-blue automobiles. So what these equations, these look like serious equations, but what they are simply doing is bookkeeping, and they're not actually putting forward any usable theory. So there's been a tradition almost in biology of people setting out to do theory on thermodynamics, information theory, and biological evolution without much result. And I think a lot of biologists are now averse to even reading or thinking about this because they've seen so many useless accounts. So what I want to do is try to do something that isn't useless. And this I did largely in the 1978 paper, and I'm extending it a little bit now. So here's the paper that I published. Macroevolution in a Model Ecosystem was in the American Naturalist precisely 40 years ago, at the beginning of 1978. And I put it forward and I thought, well, now, this will get a discussion started. Here is a model where you can do something about this. Let's talk about it. And the result was a resounding absence of reaction. The paper, over the years, garnered, until recently, had garnered only 4 citations. So let me, here is citations to that paper in Web of Science, and we see 4 of them. The latter 3 are by Nonini and Diener, and if you go look at those citations, what you find is that in the introduction of my paper, I had made a wise-ass, what we would call a wise-ass remark, an attempt at witticism. And these 3 citations of that paper are simply citing that quip and not in any way discussing the paper. Well, then you can look at the list and say, aha, here is a paper that's actually citing the 1978 paper. Well, this paper is by Martina Donaldson Matassi, Carl Bergstrom, and Michael Lachman. This citation doesn't count, and it doesn't count because Carl Bergstrom is at my university, and I was the one who told him about the 1978 paper, and he then cited it. So doesn't count. So basically, it's getting no citations. More recently, Matt Pinnell and Mary O'Connor said very nice things, in fact, somewhat excessive things about it, in a paper in American Naturalist in 2017, or sorry, in Evolution in 2017. But again, that doesn't count because I was the one who told Matt Pinnell about the paper. So if you subtract out the 2 people who I got to cite the paper, it basically has gotten no citations. Well, let's take a look at my model. The model involves energy flows from a sun into a biological, a biosphere. And you may ask, well, what sophisticated concepts of energy am I using? Well, the answer is I'm just considering energy to be stuff. It's something that flows from the sun and ends up in the biosphere. So I like to think of the energy as being denoted in energy dots. Here is the classic video game Pac-Man, and the little yellow dots are energy dots. So we're going to be talking about the flow of energy dots out from the sun, some of them into the biosphere, being retained in the biosphere for a while, and then finally flowing out into outer space. So let me show you the model very quickly. I will not show you most of the equations. I'll just tell you what the result is. In the model, here's the sun. Its energy dots are coming out from it. A certain rate of flow of energy dots is reaching a biosphere. And here's the biosphere, and it consists of organisms, and the organisms have an energy content. And E is the total content of energy in all the organisms in this biosphere. You can think of this as if it's a single plant species that's receiving energy from the sun. If you took all the individuals of the plant species and you put them in a bomb calorimeter and burned them all and measured how much energy content they had, that would be this quantity E. Now we have a rate of loss of energy, lambda. It's a rate of loss per unit time. And energy is flowing out from this organism at a rate lambda E. And at the moment, in the first version of the model, that's all that's happening. So energy is flowing in at a constant rate, alpha, which is imagined, it's very important, it's imagined to be independent of the current energy content. So if you double the energy content of that biosphere, it's still receiving the same flow of energy, alpha, coming in from the sun. And of course, the sun is giving out all sorts of other energy going out to outer space. Well, what will happen? You can write a simple differential equation for this. It's really trivial. And you can work out what happens to E. And the answer is E will rise or fall, depending on its initial condition. Here we go. Sorry. If we plot through time the total amount of energy that's flowed into this plant species, and we follow the energy content of the plant species, we find that it will equilibrate at a level which is alpha over lambda. So the species grows. Now, I should say we're counting the total energy content of all the plants. We're not bookkeeping how many of them there are. We manage by these rather unrealistic assumptions that I make to avoid the necessity of knowing how many individual plants this is. We just are concerned with their total energy content. What we're really doing here, and I have to say this as early as possible, is making a toy model. And I want to make a toy model that evolves, that has parameters that affect the flow of energy. Those parameters evolve. And we can then see what happens to the movement of energy. We can bookkeep entropy. And we can see whether we can come up with a notion of information that connects to this. So what I'm trying to do is not to give a comprehensive account of a real biosphere. What I'm trying to do is make a toy biosphere, and having this toy biosphere have some laws connecting movements of energy, entropy, and information, and see what those laws are. Because if there is a general account that we will develop at some point, which would really help integrate thermodynamics with biology, if we ever achieve that kind of understanding, I'd like to think it has to be consistent with what happens in this simple model. This is one type of oversimplified model, and we want to see what its laws are. So, next version of the model. Here's the next version where there are now two genotypes in the species, and the flow of energy in is being divided among them. And I make a particular assumption. It's not a great assumption, but it's what we have to do to make the equations work. And that is to say, we're going to assume that the energy dots coming in from the sun are divided between the two genotypes in proportion to their current energy content. So if E1 is twice as great as E2, then 2/3 of the energy coming in will go to E1 and 1/3 will go to E2. There also are rates of loss of energy from both of these genotypes. And they are lambda 1 and lambda 2. So each energy dot has a rate of loss out to outer space of either lambda 1 or lambda 2. Well, when you make this simple model, again, you can write a pair of differential equations for E1 and E2. They're very simple, and you end up looking them up. My understanding of differential equations is very weak, so I take a differential equations text and I look around until I see the equations of that form, and they're right near the beginning of every differential equations book, because these are very simple linear differential equations. And the result we get is that the energy E1 and E2 changes. And what will happen is, if you start out with a population that is mostly of genotype E1, and they have a rate of loss, they will come to an equilibrium level, very similar to what I showed you in the previous slide. And but if there's some E2s around, and if they lose energy less quickly than E1, than genotype 1, then what will happen is they will start to increase. The E2s will increase at the expense of E1, and as they do, they'll be getting more and more of the inflowing energy. So the proportions of the two genotypes shifts, and the population goes from being at a level alpha over lambda 1 up to finally having E2 take over and be at a level alpha over lambda 2. I won't show you the dynamics of this, because what we're going to do with this is, once you have those equations, you can then say, well, let's think about multiple genotypes. Let's think about a whole range of genotypes that have different values of lambda. Well, let's in particular start by making the assumption that the rates of loss are distributed in a distribution. Here's their scale. And that distribution is a simple exponential distribution. So we're starting out with a rather naive distribution of lambda values. A lot of genotypes have rather large rates of loss of energy. Some genotypes are more efficient and have a small rate of loss down here near 0, but there's a fair number of them in this distribution. But what happens if we imagine then a continuous array of possible genotypes, a large population, having a certain having energy, a distribution of energy contents of these different genotypes, and we work out the equations for change of those genotypes. Now, I should also say that this model is essentially asexual. It's essentially clonal reproduction. I haven't put any reproduction step in here. Reproduction simply shows up in this bookkeeping by retaining energy. So you have some energy, you pass some of that energy on to your offspring. That's energy that doesn't get lost. So there's not a specific reproduction step here, but reproduction is implicit in the retaining of energy. Well, let's take a look at what results. What you find is that the distribution of lambdas starts out as an exponential distribution with a mean value, which is here called lambda bar 0, and it continues to be an exponential distribution. And as it continues, it's still an exponential distribution, but its mean, remember that this is the rate of loss, a large value of it is a bad thing. The rate of loss declines towards 0, the exponential distribution tilts up more and more. And the formula for the mean of that exponential distribution is given here. So you'll see basically that the mean of the exponential, the mean rate of loss is going down. It's going down as 1 over t, 1 over something plus t. And as it does, the ecosystem is retaining energy longer and longer. Okay, so the result is that when you work out the equations for the change of the total energy content of the ecosystem, that goes up. Just as we saw with the previous genotypes, that the genotype that loses energy more slowly takes over, and the result is that the equilibrium energy content in the 2 genotype case ends up as being the equilibrium you'd expect from the more efficient genotype. Here there's a continuous array of genotypes, and so the energy content continually rises. And to my surprise, when I worked out all of this, the final rule you get is rather startling. It says that the ecosystem contains within it, at any time, essentially half of all the energy that ever flowed into it. So here's a picture of that. We'll go to the next slide. There's a total inflow of energy. That's this dotted line here. That's all the energy that ever impinged on this ecosystem, that ever flowed into any of its organisms. Here is half of that. The black curve is what you would actually see. You start out with some arbitrary size, some arbitrary exponential distribution of lambdas and an arbitrary energy content. And then what you find is that there's a little bit of shakeout of initial conditions, but finally, the total energy content of the ecosystem gets higher and higher and higher, proportional to the total inflow. And in the simple exponential case, it's actually half of the total inflow. So of the energy that ever came into that ecosystem, if you wait long enough, half of it is still around. It's not exactly half because of the initial conditions, but it becomes closer and closer to being half of the total energy inflow. Well, that seems like a rather dramatic and probably unrealistic rule for energy inflow to an ecosystem. I think we all sense that a lot more of the energy that flows into life ends up getting lost than that. And we can model that by trying some different initial distributions. And what I want to do is use not the exponential distribution, but a gamma distribution, a family of gamma distributions. So here are 2 gamma distributions where we've scaled them so that they have the same mean value of loss, which is here 3. They have different shape parameters. Some of you will be familiar with the letter, unfortunately, the letter alpha is used for the shape parameter of the gamma, and I've already been using alpha, so I'm calling it p. And when p equals 5, you get this gamma distribution here, peaked around 3. When p equals 15, it's more sharply peaked. The important thing for the behavior that we're going to discuss is the left-hand tail of that distribution. Because if you think about what's happening, you start out with a distribution of lambdas, and energy's coming in, energy's getting lost from the genotypes that have higher values of lambdas. The distribution of lambdas is shifting. And what we will find here is it continues to be in a gamma distribution. The mean of the gamma distribution shifts leftwards towards 0. And that means that as time goes on, the genotypes you will find around are the ones down here in the left-hand tail. And the left-hand tail of a gamma, if you look at the formula for it, is a simple polynomial. The term, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I went ahead. The left-hand tail goes as as lambda to the p. So for p equal 5 here, this is lambda to the 5th power. For p equal 15, this curve is lambda to the 15th power. And so the rarity, what this p does is basically show you how rare are really good genotypes. And if they're very, very rare, you want a rather large value of p. It will then be very hard to find good genotypes. It'll take a long time to get for the distribution to shift out into this range. Let's look at the curves that result. Here is the rule that you get. You stay in a gamma distribution. The value of p stays the same, but the mean rate of loss, the mean of that gamma distribution, is this here, which is lambda bar, which is 1 over lambda bar 0 plus t over p. So basically, again, a linear dependence of the mean on, a reciprocal dependence of the mean on time, with p, a large value of p, meaning that lambda bar goes up more slowly. The bigger p is, the more slowly lambda bar increases, which is reasonable because the bigger p is, the rarer the really good genotypes are. And again, when you then take this and plug it in and work out the change of the total energy content of the ecosystem, you find a linear increase of energy content, so that it implies that the ecosystem contains within it a constant fraction, 1 over p plus 1, of all the energy that ever flowed into it. Okay, so again, a somewhat startling behavior. With these distributions of lambda, we get a rather impressive linear increase, asymptotic linear increase of the energy content in the ecosystem. And it goes up at a rate which depends on this value p, and the larger p is, the more slowly it goes up. So we see then behavior like this. Here's the total inflow. Here is 1 over p plus 1 of the inflow. And here is the actual energy content that you get, starting with some arbitrary conditions. Excuse me. And again, it shakes off the initial conditions and then goes up as 1 over p plus 1. It goes up essentially linearly. So those are rather startlingly effective evolution, given these rather simple-minded rules, and given these rather perhaps unrealistic assumptions about how rates of loss of energy are distributed in the population. Okay, if we have that, what about entropy? Well, entropy is one of those things that when people hear it, it's frightening. And when I for many years was very intimidated by entropy. It was some mysterious quantity that had something or other to do with evenness of distribution of things, but I wasn't quite sure what that was. In high school, secondary school, at one point I read about, there was this thing called entropy, and we had a substitute teacher one day who knew somewhat more physics. This was in our physics class. We had a substitute teacher who claimed that he knew more physics than our regular teacher. So he said, do any of you have any questions of things of interest that you might like to ask? So I raised my hand and I said, sir, what is entropy? And he was taken aback by that. And he then said, well, it's too complicated to explain, but let me just say that what it says is you pay for what you get. That was the only explanation I got of that's the only explanation I got of entropy. But what it is for our purposes in this simple model is a quantity which takes the three places that energy can be in this model, and those three places are in the sun, in the biosphere B, or in outer space. And they each have energy contents. I've been talking to you about the energy content of the biosphere. I've been talking about the flow of energy from the sun in. By the way, can I say to the person doing the webcam, the image of the audience that I'm seeing has frozen. I'm not really sure what that means. Can I ask, am I still coming across? Can you hear me? Everything's fine. Yeah, the image at the front is frozen, but that's fine. Okay, so what we'll do is calculate an entropy, but we're most interested in what difference the biological evolution makes to this entropy. So there'll be some sort of energy content of the sun, which I haven't even talked about. It'll be some number. What you get to get entropy is you simply add up over the three compartments the total energy content in that compartment divided by the temperature. So the temperature of the sun is some very large number. Some parts of the sun are around 6,000 degrees Celsius, and other parts are much hotter. So it'll be some rather large number here for TS and reasonably large number for ES. So there'll be a contribution from this term. Now we've been talking about EB, the energy content of the biosphere, which is this thing that's been going up linearly. There's a temperature of the biosphere. What is that? Well, it's roughly the temperature at which we all live. So it's something like today's temperature, and that's in the denominator. And then the energy that's lost from this model biosphere goes out to a place that we're going to call outer space, and it all goes there where it exists there's a very low temperature, around 2.7 degrees Celsius for the cosmic background temperature. So there will be a term, which will be rather large, of energy in outer space. So we have these three here. But the interesting question for us is not what that number is, or even how much is here and how much is there. The interesting part will be the middle term. And the middle term, if we ask the question, what difference does that middle term make? If we have a biosphere that's catching the energy and then after a while losing it, it will make a difference here in that the energy will be at this temperature instead of out in outer space at that temperature. And if you work out the difference that the biosphere makes, and you say the contribution to entropy when there's a biosphere around, particularly an evolving biosphere, will turn out to be lower than it would be if there were no biosphere. If we simply allowed the sun's energy to go out to outer space without encountering a biosphere and didn't have this middle term, the difference that it makes is E sub B over times 1 over the temperature of outer space minus 1 over the temperature of the biosphere. Temperature of the biosphere is moderate, our current temperature. Temperature of outer space is very low. So this number here is much bigger than that number. And this quantity then will be positive. This is the decrease of entropy caused by the existence of the biosphere. So the biosphere is holding on to energy at a moderate temperature for a while before releasing it into outer space where it'll exist at a much lower temperature. It's preventing some of the increase of entropy. It's delaying some of the increase of entropy in the whole system. So that's nice, but it also means that this delay, as the biosphere rises in energy content, the amount of total delay will be getting greater and greater. So the effect of evolving life is that it delays the increase of entropy and delays it more and more and more as there comes to be a bigger, richer, more efficient biosphere on our imaginary planet. So that's interesting. Now, if you look back at some of the early papers on trying to give an account of energy, entropy, and information, you actually find some people standing up and saying that the life evolves so as to increase entropy as much as possible. There actually are statements like that out there in the literature. Again, they're not really based on any models of what happens when life evolves. Here we have a ridiculously oversimplified model, but nevertheless a model. And we see that what it does is the opposite. What it does is show that life evolves so as to increasingly delay the increase of entropy. Okay, so there's energy, there's evolution, there's entropy. What about information? Let us go to the issue of some kind of measure of information. And when we do, what we'll find, I see I'm running out of time, so what I'll skip over this rather quickly. If we make a version that is an energy measure an information measure that is very similar to specified information, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar, we will see that the one I'm going to put forward is to say, here's the initial distribution of lambdas, here is a later distribution of lambdas, shifted to the left. We can consider this to be a fraction of that. If we don't rescale this one to keep its area 1, but you just let energy be lost from the system, you find that you end up, the new distribution is a fraction p of the old one, and you can make an energy, a specified information like measure, which is this minus log p. If you want to denote energy in bits, you'd make it log 2. And it turns out to have this formula when you work it out with all of the differential equations. So information goes up. The information in a typical organism goes up, but it doesn't go up linearly. It goes up basically as proportional to the logarithm of time, which is a somewhat dismaying rule. You'd like to think that there's some rule out there that says proportional to the flow of energy through the ecosystem, or proportional to the increase of entropy, what you get for that is a proportional amount of information. Well, when you look at this rule, it's not proportional. It goes up as log t. Well, somebody might come along and say, well, okay, but this is a measure of the amount of information in a typical individual. What about the fact that you've got a lot of individuals? Shouldn't you measure the total amount of information not as log t, but as the total energy content, proportional to the total energy content? If you make the information measure, if you do it that way, essentially adding up all the information of all the individuals in the biosphere, then what you get is T log T. And again, T log T is not linear. It's kind of going up a little bit faster than linear. And it's not proportional to what entropy is doing. So we end up with rules. The interesting thing about this model, it's a ridiculously oversimplified model. It has rules about energy flow, rules about increase of information, and a rule about measures of information, with 2 different ones here, one per individual and one total. Neither of them shows the proportionality to increase of entropy that you intuitively like to have. So there's my toy model. There are the rules that come out. And there are lots of more things to do. Is it reasonable to have energy inputs be proportional to current energy content? That's somewhat arbitrary. What about gamma distributions? What about other distributions? You can work with other distributions. What you can show is this has a relationship to the moment generating function, well, to the Laplace transform of those distributions. It will lead to somewhat different rules. Different families of distributions will lead to different rules for the rate of information increase. And then you can say, what have we left out of the model? We've left out genetic drift. It's a completely deterministic model. We haven't had any mutation. We just had clonal reproduction. And so there's nothing like gene interactions or recombination here. They just don't exist in this model. So the purpose of the model, I just want to finally end by saying, is as a toy model to see what rules we get out of a toy model. So if anything, this is far more ambitious, on the one hand, far more ambitious than Fisher's fundamental theorem, and on the other hand, by restriction to this rather silly model, it's far less ambitious. But I hope it's a small step on the path towards an integration of rules of thermodynamics with rules of increase of biological information as a result of this process, which is, of course, natural selection. Here are some references of the papers by Boltzmann, Dembski, Mine, Hazen, Orgel, Pennell, Schuster, and Shostak. So with that rather megalomaniac presentation, I will yield myself up to questions, and I hope we can get the cameras pointed in the right direction so that I can see you and answer questions. Thank you very much. And,
you seem to be wanting to prove Fisher's theorem in the absence of any genetics.
yes, yes.
And Fisher, of course, had an interest.
One minor defect with the model is it doesn't have any genetics. It has genetics.
Fisher also, as you know, studied statistical mechanics and Boltzmann's ideas behind it. But let's have some questions.
Yeah, I still cannot see the audience.
Can you? There they are. Can you see them now?
No, all I'm seeing is the picture of them an hour ago.
Can you hear them? Can you hear me?
I'm being told that it's impossible. So
can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you, Walter.
Okay, then if I have the microphone to anyone who wants a question, then you can at least hear them.
Yeah, and I should say that I saw clear enough images of the audience to recognize Brian Charlesworth, John Turner, Adam Ayer Walker, Peter Keatling, and of course you. So I got at least that. Yes, questions?
Hello. Okay, it works. The theory of the fundamental theorem, we have that with an increased variance in reproductive success, you have more basically efficient natural selection. What about here, if you consider entropy as some sort of variance, like that tells us about the uncertainty in this spread of the information? Does it have any basically connection with how would you expect the system to evolve?
Okay. People should, by the way, take into account that there's about a 1.5 second delay from you to me and another 1.5 second coming back. So there will be some rather weird delays here. I would not think that the entropies that I've calculated are anything to do with the genetic variance. I would think that the distributions that I drew had parameters like p that reflected how much variance there was in these lambdas. And I think that is the counterpart to additive genetic variants. In our case, we have clonal reproduction. So in a sense, genetic variance is, you don't even have additive genetic variants, you just have total genetic variants. But it's not in the entropy terms, it's in these, the shape of the distribution. And if you're going to have an increase in genetic variance, that would be by somehow during the process this quantity p changing. At the moment in the present, with the present formulas, that doesn't happen. And the p stays the same. But that's where I look to see the counterpart of Fisher's additive genetic variance.
Could I just insert a question there in relation to that? How important is it that you use an asymmetrical distribution? What happens if you just assume it's normal?
Yes, the entire universe collapses. The reason being that this lambda is positive, and it comes to a limit at 0. It cannot be the rate of loss of energy cannot be less than 0. Put in a normal distribution, and a small tail will stick over past 0. And you'll be not losing information, you'll be gaining it back from the universe, and something terrible will happen. So I urge people not to use normal distributions. On the other hand,
just use a log normal instead.
A log normal, yeah, log normal will work. I have looked at that, and it gives a, instead of a linear, let's see, I believe instead of a linear increase of energy content, it now heals over and goes up more quickly at first and more slowly thereafter. And the rule for information is also different. That's very relevant distribution, but a straight normal distribution won't work. Won't work at all in this model.
Any other questions?
Joe, this is Brian. Your model
Yes.
seems to assume that fitness in some ways is related to the rate of energy loss, right? That's essentially the determinant of the rate of reproduction of a genotype in biological terms. Is there any reason to believe that's true?
Well, first of all, reproduction in this model is lack of loss of the energy. You reproduce, and the energy in you that's in that infant, and then thereafter the infant starts taking in energy of its own. So it's not it's not that loss is good for you, loss is bad for you. Loss in a sense means less reproduction. So and it's evolving in this case towards 0. So yeah, what I would like to do is put some more terms for differences, genetic differences in the uptake of energy, but I only have initial ideas how to do that. Putting those in, one would then get a slightly more satisfying connection between these parameters and what we might conventionally think of as fitness. Remember that I'm not bookkeeping individuals here. I'm simply aggregating all individuals of a given genotype and counting their total energy content without regard to whether that's one big individual or a lot of small individuals. So it's kind of hard to talk about our usual notions of fitness.
Hi, it's John Turner. You going to change that?
Hello, John.
Hi, Joe.
By the way, John, I think I showed it to you, but one of my photographs at the first BGG shows you.
It's a beautiful shot of the back of my head. It's quite wonderful. Yeah, I just going back to thinking about Fisher. I don't know right in thinking that there's something of the sort that you've just put down, somewhere floating at the back of Fisher's mind, because But this idea that, let's say, the fundamental theorem of natural selection is some kind of counterpoise to the second law of thermodynamics, something to do with his training by genes. And there's something of Bergson in here too. I mean, the thing about trying to understand fishes, you have to understand Bergson first if you really want to find out what fish is thinking. But sorry, I'm just floating an idea.
I've heard of Bergson, but I don't know how he connects exactly here. I do know that Fisher did talk, I think in the genetical theory of natural selection, he says that the fundamental theorem plays a role similar to the second law of thermodynamics. I don't see the exact connection, but it's very clear that Fisher was very influenced by physical, by thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. In his 1922 work, where he's the first one to do diffusion equations in diffusion processes in population genetics, it's explicitly, he does it by recycling the heat equation.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi. I'm confused about why you're using Kullback-Leibler divergence as your measure of information. Information is about communication. Shannon defined it in terms of the difference between two entities. Kolmogorov did it a different way, but what you're using is just a way of describing the difference between two distributions. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with communication. So why that particular formulation?
I think I can argue that the amount of information you would have to provide in order to go from the one to subsample the one distribution from the other is this measure. But there is some ambiguity of which of several ways we should measure there. The specified information actually of Orgel actually works very similarly to the thing I'm using. It's just a little less tractable. So if there's any justification for what Orgel had said, then there might be justification for me saying that this is something like specified information. I'm not using the Shannon measure, which is really a measure of, it's sort of a measure of channel capacity. Doesn't necessarily address whether the information you receive over that channel means anything. And here we're trying to use these notions of specified information, which try to focus you on one scale, something like lambda, and ask bookkeep information, count information if it tells you about things, about efficient, if it makes you increasingly efficient on that scale. Let's put it that way. I have a feeling this is an unsatisfying answer, but it's the one I have.
Anyone else? Well, if not, Joe, thanks for a stimulating talk. It's conventional that at the end of the talk, I give you a silver bowl with the inscription on it. I can't do that. We don't have teleporters anymore. But I can assure you we're going to find a mechanism by which that gets to you one way or another. And thank you again for an interesting talk.
So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks very much to Joe, if he's still there. Well done, Joe. Thanks. Fantastic to see him on such a large scale there. Thanks very much, of course, to Sir Walter for introducing that fantastic session. I should also take the opportunity just to thank, just a couple of notes just before we go on to that poster session, just to thank the Fisher Memorial Trust particularly for funding 4 bursaries for students who would otherwise be unable to come to this event, this meeting from overseas. They were given each £250, I think, to come here, so that's fantastic. Thanks very much to the committee for that. What happens now is there's a poster session back up where you had your lunch, and it goes on to at least 8 o'clock, possibly a bit later. To get there, you need to do the same thing you did for lunch, but in the dark. But there'll be stewards to help you get up there. You simply have to go through Up the stairs, past the monkey stairs, the quantum stairs where those monkeys are, go to the tiny little door in the wall